Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. I hope I'm audible. So we begin with our next module on the Head and Neck Weekly webinar series. So we recently completed our first module on the neck, and we've had some eminent speakers join us for that, and we've had a great response. And so we begin with the oral module today, and the first session today is going to be on oral pre-malignant lesions. I welcome you all to it. So we also are parallelly running our COMET series, that is the continuing medical education series. We've begun with the minimally invasive head and neck surgery modules. The first one was started on previous Sunday, and we had some great international speakers join us from all over the world, and it was truly a riveting session. We have the next session coming up on the coming Sunday, and this will be hosted and coordinated by Dr. Akshay Kurpaje, who's my senior colleague. So I'm really thankful to all our senior colleagues, Dr. Ravi Nair sir, the Dean at HCG, Dr. Vishal Rao, and Dr. Akshay Kurpaje, who've mentored me and helped all of us set up this webinar series, and I think we are gaining a lot of momentum in the recent days. So just to introduce this module to you, we have a lot of great topics coming up in the coming weeks. Just to tell you that this is a bi-weekly session, and we have some great international speakers also joining us with a lot of national faculty as well. So please stay tuned. We'll be coming up with the complete list in some time. So quickly to move on to today's session, I welcome Dr. Shubhra Chauhan, who's a consultant head and neck surgeon at Chennai. She works at VS Hospitals in Chennai, and she's also a head and neck oncosurgeon trained at Narayan Hridayalaya, and she's also a holder of the IFNOS fellowship as well. So welcome, ma'am. I hand over the session to you to introduce the speaker, Dr. Devendra Chauhan.
Morning, everybody. Thanks, Shalini, for those words. And I think sir doesn't need much introduction, but we'll just for the completion, sir is of course a surgical oncologist with a special interest in head and neck oncology, and he's currently the professor at Tata Memorial, Bombay. Just to elicit, he has around more than 238 publications with 2,000 citations to his credit. Of course, an exemplary surgeon with a great mentor to all of us. Sir, over to you. You can start sharing your screen, sir.
Yeah, I'll do that. Shubhra, yeah. Thank you for that kind introduction. And thanks Akshay and the HCG team for having me here today. So can you see my screen now?
Yeah. So you just shift to slide.
I'll make it full screen. Yeah. Now it's all right.
Yeah. And for everybody's benefit, you can start putting your questions in the chat box. We will take it with sir at the end of the session. So you can start putting as and when you have questions around it. Thanks, sir. Please take over.
That's perfect, Shubhra. Thank you. So the topic given to me today is to kick off this series on oral cancer is obviously the pre-malignant disorders, a comprehensive review on clinical aspects and management. Sorry for the spelling mistake. So to begin with, there was a lot of confusion regarding a lot of definitions. And as I trained, when I trained and when I gave my exams, I remember, scrambling and asking people, what is a lesion? What is a condition? Please tell me what classifies as a lesion? What is a condition? There was a lot of confusion. So earlier WHO said that any lesion which can transform into malignancy or has the potential to transform into malignancy is called a pre-malignant lesion. And a generalized state in which you can have malignancy appearing more than normal tissue is called a pre-malignant condition. That was the definition at that time. So SMF, for example, was a condition, and leukoplakia or erythroplakia was a lesion. And we all used to get confused all the time. So thankfully, in 2008, the WHO changed this definition and said, let's call it pre-malignant disorders. So all of this lesions and condition is now done away with, and we call it now pre-malignant disorders in which the risk of malignancy is present, and it is more than the adjacent mucosa. So then they changed the term pre-malignant into potentially oral potentially malignant lesions. And they changed this because it implies that some of these lesions, not all, will inevitably become malignant. That means there is a statistical chance that some of them may progress. Hence, they said that potentially malignant is a better term than pre-malignant. Pre-malignant implies that most of them or all of them will become malignant. It is pre-malignant. That's why now the term potentially malignant. That implies that not all, but some of them potentially can develop into malignancy. So there is a risk of progression, which is statistical. Now, this is a difficult topic, and I quote this statement. It is one of the most important problems in oral medicine. Yes, it is important, but the way we have handled it is not we have not made much progress. The handling and the progress that we've made in management of pre-malignant lesions has not been great. So let us see what we have done so far and what we can do, and let us try and answer some of the queries or some of the frequently asked questions that we face when we are treating pre-malignant lesions. So first is pre-malignant. What is the prevalence? So there is varied prevalence. If you look at literature, depending on geographical location, depending on habits of people, you will have prevalence which has a wide range. But if you look at this meta-analysis, a systemic review and a meta-analysis, the global prevalence is about 5%. Now, as I said, it varies geographically, and the type of lesion varies depending on the etiology, that is, depending on the habits in that particular region. So we have in our Indian subcontinent, we have high incidence of submucous fibrosis because of chewing betel quid. And in Western countries, because of smoking, they have high incidence of floor, mouth, and tongue leukoplakia. So the site of lesion, the type of lesion, and the incidence varies geographically and depending on the etiology and the habits in that country. Now there are a host of pre-malignant lesions. You can classify them into those before 2017 and after 2017. So you have these common leukoplakias, erythroplakias, the erythroleukoplakias, the proliferative leukoplakias, and the list goes on and on. You can mark this list, but what you need to remember is some of the important ones that we will see in our outpatient department every day. Some of the uncommon ones we are unlikely to see and treat. We must know the common ones, the differential diagnosis of the common ones, and the potential of them to turn malignant. What is the potential? What is the statistical chance that this lesion that is in front of you will turn malignant? And that will dictate how you treat these lesions. So let us look at some of the common lesions first. Leukoplakia, again, underwent considerable changes in its definition. And finally, now we call it a plaque which cannot be characterized pathologically as any other disorder, which has a statistically increased chance of turning malignant. Now, there are two important things when you define leukoplakia that you need to remember. One, it is a lesion which is it is a clinical definition. It is a clinical classification. It is not a pathological classification. You cannot pathologically characterize any lesion into leukoplakia. It is a clinical classification. And second, some of them will develop malignant changes. There are types of leukoplakias, as all of you know. The good leukoplakias and the ugly leukoplakias. The good leukoplakias are the homogeneous, white, flat, thin, have a smooth surface, and generally they do not trouble us. The non-homogeneous one are the one which we need to look at, and as I talk about the clinical and the histological parameters of transformation, we'll talk about this. But just remember, leukoplakia is homogeneous and non-homogeneous. In non-homogeneous, you can have spectral, nodular, verrucous, and a mix of red spots between the white spots called as erythroleukoplakia. Again, as I said, differential diagnosis, this is only for postgraduate students who would be asked probably as what are the differential diagnosis of a white plaque-like lesion in the oral cavity. But in your outpatient department, if you have to remember a couple of lesions that you will commonly see or commonly mistake for leukoplakia, and one that we commonly mistake is candidiasis. Second is frictional lesion, and third is lichen planus. Now you have to differentiate these from classical leukoplakia because that has management implications. A quick mention on proliferative verrucous leukoplakia, and that is because I recently saw a case, an elderly lady, which classically fits into this description of proliferative verrucous leukoplakia, came to me before the lockdown. She had a proliferative lesion on the hard palate near the upper gingiva. After the lockdown, I lost touch with her and she came back now when the lockdown was open and the lesion was exactly the same. We had biopsied at that time. Obviously, the biopsy was negative. So this is a classical lesion. This is a leukoplakia, which is proliferative. We excised it. I excised it, and the final histopathology came as well-differentiated squamous carcinoma or varicose carcinoma. So you must remember, proliferative varicose leukoplakia are proliferative lesions, usually seen in elderly females, and they have a high chance of malignant transformation or malignancy being present in them. So you need to excise this, and we'll talk about which ones to excise and which ones not to excise, or which ones which can be observed. But this is a lesion which will fox you because they are proliferative, and all your biopsies will definitely come negative. So you have to take a negative histology consent and go ahead and excise these lesions. Right, so there is some classification. So leukoplakia has been the one which is extensively studied, and I'll come to why it has been extensively studied so much. So there's a WHO classification on the probability of malignant change and prognosis of these lesions. So as I said earlier, homogeneous and non-homogeneous, they have classified it into phase 1, which is thin, smooth leukoplakia, which has a better prognosis. And then you get to phase 2, which becomes thick and fissured. Phase 3 becomes the proliferative leukoplakia, and then the erythroleukoplakia. The phase 3 and 4 have a higher malignant transformation rate. There is a Van der Waals classification akin to the TNM. They tried to fit it like the TNM with the size criteria and the pathological presence of dysplasia or no dysplasia, and tried to stage it into stage 1, 2, 3, and 4, and assign it the chance of malignant transformation. Erythroleukoplakia is a fiery red patch which cannot be clinically or pathologically classified as any other disease. Now, erythroleukoplakia is less prevalent than leukoplakia itself, but it is more common to develop malignancy. So these are the kind of fiery red lesions that you will see in the buccal mucosa and the hard palate or the tongue, and the chances of malignant transformation are higher. Again, there is a differential diagnosis of erythroleukoplakias, and this is for the postgraduates. If you want, you can. These slides will be shared, so you can keep this in case your examiner asks about what are the differential diagnoses of red lesions in the oral cavity. The third commonly seen lesion in our practice is lichen planus, which is a cell-mediated dysfunction. It is an inflammatory disease. And classically, you will see a white lacy reticular pattern called the Wickham striae, which is a small white dots in between these lines, white lines which join each other. The differential diagnosis between this and leukoplakia, it is usually bilateral, and many a times it is superimposed with candidal infection. It is potentially pre-malignant, and there was a lot of debate whether lichen planus is pre-malignant, but overall it is considered to be now as a pre-malignant disorder. Submucous fibrosis, the last common lesion that we see very commonly in our practice, and we will talk about this in detail a bit later. But generally, patient presents in or can be classified into 4 grades. If he comes early, there is ulceration, stomatitis, burning in his mouth. As the grade progresses, it becomes mottled. It becomes marble-like sheets of epithelium, and because of collagen fibrosis in the subepithelial tissue, you get pale adherent mucosa, which becomes progressively thickened, and then you get this kind of trismus with fibrotic bands on the buccal mucosa, leading to extreme trismus. Now, what do you do? We have looked at some of the common lesions. The question that you ask yourself is, what do you do with these lesions? So to decide what to do with these lesions, you must know the transformation rate to malignancy of these lesions. And I draw your attention to a recent publication, I think it's last year's publication, of a transformation of these lesions. And if you look at it, erythroplakia and proliferative varicose leukoplakia have a high transformation rate, both cumulative and yearly. While lichen planus, oral lichenoid lesions, and submucous fibrosis have slightly lower transformation rate. And leukoplekia is somewhere in between. So the most common lesion that we see in our practice is leukoplekia, which is 8.6% cumulative transformation with 1.56% malignant transformation rate per year. So this is the transformation rates which must be kept in mind, because it is important when we manage these lesions. So let us look at which lesions and are likely to transform into malignancy. So let us classify them into clinical prognostic factors. And the first that comes to our mind is the location of the lesion. So location of the lesion firstly varies with etiology. So as I said earlier, in the West, the lesions are more common in the tongue and the floor mouth because they are more smokers.
Shalini, can you just check with sir? I think his net connection is
High.
Sir. So hello.
Hello.
Yes, sir. We lost you for a moment. Sorry.
Okay. Can you see my screen, or should I?
No, you'll have to reshare it, sir.
I'll do that. All right.
So can we start with the slides, sir? Because I think it went on mute when you started the slide.
Which slide?
The previous one, sir.
This one?
Right, sir. Right.
This one. Okay.
No, sir. The next. This was fine. The next one. Yeah. Okay. From here, clinical progression. Right, sir. Thanks.
Right. So to decide how to treat these lesions, we must know which lesion is likely to progress to malignancy. And for that, we have to look at the clinical factors and histological factors. So first, let us look at which clinical factors will predict progression to malignancy. Location of the lesion varies according to etiology. And as I said earlier, Western countries have more lesions on the tongue and floor of the mouth. In the Indian subcontinent, we have more lesions on the buccal mucosa and the gingiva because of chewed tobacco. In the southern states, where reverse smoking is predominant, you have lesions over the palate. Now, the progression to malignancy, site versus progression, is debatable. Some of the researchers say there is no difference whether the lesion is on the tongue or other sites. But most of the researchers say that a lesion which is situated on the tongue and floor mouth has higher transformation rates than those lesions on the buccal mucosa and the gingiva. Clinical appearance is very important. As I said earlier, we classify lesions as simplex, homogeneous, non-homogeneous, speckled, red lesions, flat white lesions. So more homogeneous the lesion, more white the lesion, more flat the lesion, they are unlikely to trouble you and unlikely to develop into malignancy. As the lesion becomes non-homogeneous, becomes speckled, you have red dots or fiery red lesion, then the chances of malignancy increase. One of the publications says that none of the homogeneous lesions progress to malignancy versus 4.6% of the verrucous and 28% of the erosive lesions that progressed to malignancy. Other clinical parameters that you must keep in mind, apart from location and appearance of the lesion, are size. So any size which is greater than 200 millimeters or 2 centimeters is likely to become malignant. Age and duration of the lesion. So remember that the lesion, if it has to turn malignant, the highest incidence is in the first 5 years. And the median time to transformation is about 32 months. And more elderly the patient, the higher is the transformation rate. It is also higher in females as compared to males, 13 versus about 2%. And in non-smokers, the transformation rate is higher. Now remember, these lesions are commonly seen in people with habits. And if you continue habits, the transformation rate is higher. But if you see a lesion in a non-smoker, be very careful, because the transformation rate in non-smokers or people who don't have any habit, the transformation rate is quite high. So we looked at clinical parameters, and let us look at histological parameters. And all of you know of, we always talk of presence or absence of dysplasia. And all of you are aware of the definition of mild dysplasia, but a quick recap. So dysplasia is mild dysplasia is architectural disturbances which are limited to lower third of the epithelium. and it is accompanied by cytological atypia. Moderate, it extends to the middle third. Severe, it is more than 2/3 of the epithelium which is involved, and there is complete cytological atypia. And carcinoma in situ, as seen here, is complete destruction, but or complete atypia, and the entire epithelium is architecturally disturbed, but there is no invasion of the basement membrane. And when you have invasion of the basement membrane, we call it as invasive cancer. So these are the stages: mild, moderate, and severe dysplasia. Now, the severity of the dysplasia, why do we need to classify this? Because the severity of the dysplasia is a prognostic factor for malignant transformation. So you have a very low rate of 4% in mild dysplasia, which increases as the grade of dysplasia increases to moderate and severe. So that will help us make a decision when to intervene and when to wait and watch. The problem with dysplasia, but is there is a lot of inter-observer variability. Now, if you ask two pathologists, one may say this is mild, one may say it is moderate, and two others may say it is moderate, and some may say it is severe. So there is very little concordance between the pathologists regarding dysplasia, and hence there was an effort to have a binary classification instead of three classifications. So instead of saying that it is mild, moderate, severe, there was a proposal by the WHO to say that some of the dysplasias or some of these lesions can be characterized as high risk depending on the histological characteristics, and some can be classified as low risk. So depending on cellular changes and architectural changes, which are listed here, if you have 5 cytological and 4 architectural changes, then you classify this histologically as a high risk lesion. And if you have anything less than that, then you classify it as a low risk lesion. Now, this was shown to have a better pathological concordance between the pathologists, and this was better than classifying the dysplasia as mild, moderate, and severe. So nowadays, we classify lesions or ask a pathologist to classify lesions whether they are high risk, depending on these cellular and architectural changes, or low risk, and then you can make a decision regarding the management. Right, no talk is complete without basic molecular markers and biomarkers as a prediction for transformation. So we saw clinical, we saw histological, and of course there will be some biomarkers or something that the lab will give us. Now, if you look at these biomarkers and if you Google it, you'll have more than 2,500 publications, or more than that. This is just one systemic review that I'm quoting, where they saw 2,500 publications, and they took 132 and found around 113 biomarkers. Now, one thing in medicine, which is more true in surgery and true in any walk of medicine, is the more type of biomarkers or more type of techniques that you have. So in surgery, hernia management, we have 6 types of or 8 types of repairs for hernia. That tells you that not even one of them has stood the test of time, and not one is better than the other. That's why you keep hunting for more and more, and that is exactly what has happened with biomarkers. There are so many biomarkers because the earlier ones that were detected, we still do not have a biomarker which can pinpoint and tell us that this lesion is likely to become malignant. I've listed some of the common ones, and the common ones which are often quoted and often used in many papers. They are never used in clinical practice as of now. As P53, proliferative markers like the Ki67 and PCNA, and LOH. Now, there's a lot of publication on loss of heterozygosity, and if it is present, it signifies a higher risk of malignant transformation. But yet, it is not routinely used, I may say, in clinical practice. Right. So let us, in a nutshell, let us see what we have covered so far. So any lesion, pre-malignant lesion, we've looked at the common pre-malignant lesions. We looked at the clinical criteria. We looked at histological criteria. We looked at the biomarkers. Let us put them all into one chart. So if you have a lesion which is large, it is non-homogeneous. Any lesion that is red, angry appearing, a lesion situated on the tongue floor mouth, it is more likely to turn malignant. You need to act on these lesions. Female, more than 50 years of age, non-smokers, yes, these are lesions, again, that should put your antennae up. You need to do something about these lesions. And histological criteria, if the biopsy tells you that this is HPV positive, which is not so common in the oral cavity. Now, there are studies in the oral cavity which have shown an association of about 20% of these lesions will have HPV positive. These are more common in the oropharynx, not so much in the oral cavity. But aneuploidy and LOH are two things which have been studied extensively. And if the biopsy tells you that you have a problem with the DNA content or the LOH, loss of heterozygosity, then you need to act on these lesions and look at it more carefully than you would otherwise. Right. So we've looked at what are the common lesions. We looked at which lesions are likely to turn malignant. Now let's look at management of these lesions. And I put this photo up because this is what we commonly are asked, and this is what we commonly foxed in our routine practice. You have a large diffuse lesion. Now, if you decide to excise all these lesions, sometimes you land up with a significant deformity and dysfunction. So you need to exactly know which lesions to observe, which lesions to biopsy, if to biopsy, when to biopsy, and if to treat, how to treat and how much to excise. What are the margins? Where do you take a biopsy from? Whether to treat this lesion or not. These are the questions that are normally associated with early pre-malignant lesions of the oral cavity. Now, when you're managing lesions of the oral cavity, and I need to cover this a little bit, there are three types of preventions that we know of. One is primary prevention, where you stop the habits and don't allow these lesions to form. Secondary prevention, which we try and detect these lesions early, and screening is the method of secondary detection. And tertiary prevention, where you, after treating a lesion, you prevent second primary, development of second primary. So I'll touch upon all of these in a bit. So I put up this again, because when we come to management, we must realize that the upper two lesions with low transformation rate, you can relax and not be too worried about. The lower two lesions below the leukoplakia, you must be worried about. Erythroplakia, proliferative leukoplakia. So these are the lesions that you don't need to think too much about. The transformation rate is high. Most of them will turn malignant. So you need to treat these lesions. The above lesions, transformation rate is low. You can keep them under observation unless there is some criteria to operate them. The most common is the leukoplakia, and that is where most of the debate lies. The transformation rate is somewhere in the middle, 8.6 cumulative and 2% per year. And you really have to think, usually they're diffuse, they're large lesions sometimes, and you really have to think what to do with these lesions, how to biopsy them, and how to treat them. So quickly cover a couple of aspects. Since we are at early lesions, we must talk about a little bit of screening. I'm not going to go into great details of screening, and I must mention this lovely randomized trial that was reported in the Lancet, done at Kerala. This was a cluster randomized trial where they divided the clusters into two groups. One group had visual screening by trained health workers at a 3-yearly interval, and the second group had only health education. It was a simple design. They used pure white light for oral examination, and the lesions were classified as normal or non-referable lesions, or referable lesions that were either pre-cancer or suggestive of cancer. As I said, health workers did the study and then referred these lesions to a center which was for further management. Coming to the results, I'm not going to the details of the study, but if you look at the results, if you look at, it was a negative study. If you look at the entire population, there was no difference in the death rates, in the mortality. But if you look at patients with high risk, patients who use tobacco and who had alcohol as their consumed alcohol, there was a significant difference in the death rates between those who had visual examination or screening and those who had only health education. There was a considerable decrease in mortality. So what did the screening tell us? Well, it was a negative trial. If you do it in the community, probably not cost effective. But if you do it in a cohort which is high risk, tobacco chewers, alcohol consumers, then you had a 34% reduction in the mortality between these two. And also, what screening does is that it detected a high percentage of early cancers in the intervention arm. Now, that is important because, as we know, most of our cases come in the advanced stage. If you detect them early, the treatment is that much easier, the morbidity is that much lesser. So that is the advantage of screening. Now, there was a problem with oral examination that, the sensitivity is not great. 5 to 15% of the general population will have lesions. We all have inflammatory lesions. So usually you get confused whether these are pre-malignant lesions, whether need to refer these lesions, not to refer these lesions. So white light is by itself not a great tool to assess these lesions. And sometimes, the health workers, even some of us can't differentiate these white patches, whether they are likely to progress or not to progress into malignancy. So again, I'll touch upon a little bit of aids on screening. So you have these cafeteria approach. Various tools are available in the market. Brush cytology, you have various light imaging techniques, you have various dyes, blue dye, to tell you what it is. Quickly, I'll touch upon a few of these. And one of the most commonly used, or one of the most commonly stated, is the toluidine blue staining, which is a vital stain which stains the nucleic acid. The problem with this is it has high false positives, and hence it is not routinely used. One area where it is used, and as I said, sometimes you have large lesions which are heterogeneous. Means part of them may be fat and nice, and part of them may be a little bit of irregular. And that is sometimes some people use toluidine blue to help you make a decision where to biopsy the lesion from, but not routinely used in clinical practice. Brush biopsy is collection of cells transepithelially. They classify into positive or atypical and negative. The problem with brush biopsy is that it is not a diagnosis in itself. Scalpel biopsy, histopathology is essential. Again, you have high false positive rates because of inflammation that we have in most of our patients. Again, like the toluidine blue, it can be beneficial if you have multiple lesions in the oral cavity. So you don't need to keep biopsying all the lesions. You can use the brush biopsy as a screening tool to take brush samples, and then those which come as atypical or positive can be followed up with scalpel biopsy instead of putting a scalpel at all lesions in the oral cavity. Light-based systems are many in the market. You have the blue-white light where you give 1% acetic acid wash. It takes off all the residue, and then you shine the blue-white light, which is absorbed better by the DNA and by the nucleic acids, and it usually gives aceto-white, or the abnormal area appears white. Now, again, very few studies, there is not strong evidence for this. Whether to use toluidine blue, some people have used toluidine blue with this blue-white light to improve the accuracy, but yet the sensitivity, specificity are not very high, and these are still in early trials. You have tissue fluorescence imaging, which looks at the autofluorescence of the tissue. As you know, all the changes in structure and metabolism of the epithelium alters with the way the light is absorbed and reflected. And this is made used by shining different wavelengths of light on the mucosa. Abnormal mucosa appears darker, and that is the area where you need to biopsy. So these are the tools that aid you, or are considered to be slightly better than white light, to tell you some areas which are otherwise missed by routine clinical examination can be used with these aids can be used. Again, fluorescence spectroscopy, a similar principle, but they use various excitation wavelengths. So there is a host of tools that are available with you, but the evidence today is very sparse for it to be used in routine practice. Narrowband imaging used by many nowadays, especially in the larynx and sometimes in the oral cavity as well. It gives you kind of an architecture of the capillaries, and there is a chart which is given to you and tells you that this area is abnormal or this area is normal. Some people use some of these techniques to take margins, especially when you're doing a laser choroidectomy. Not so much in the oral cavity, I've not seen it used, but laser, many people use it to narrowband imaging, to see whether the dysplasia or the changes extend beyond what is clinically seen. So taking margins, sometimes narrowband imaging can be of help. This is the kind of lesions that you get, the capillary changes, and you have a chart which tells you that these capillary changes are abnormal and you need to excise a little more than what you would otherwise excise. Let us sum it up, screening and these tools. So visual examination is the best if currently in society. If you need to do screening, you must do visual examination. It has a potential to reduce mortality in high risk individual. So, but general screening in general population is not cost effective. So we do not have level 1 evidence yet, according to the Cochrane meta-analysis, for screening in the general population, but certainly in the high risk population, oral cancer screening will probably play a role. And regarding the aids that we use to support our treatment, there is no robust evidence yet to support the adjuncts like toluidine blue, brush biopsy, fluorescence imaging versus primary eye. So you can use them for particularly attempting where to biopsy, and as margins, as NBI is somewhere used, but there's not much evidence today to use any of these aids in routine practice. So as I said, this is just a repeat, right? So we come back to this chart that I said earlier. We have clinical, I said, so basically you base your decision on your clinical judgment, on visual examination, and biopsy of the lesion and histological parameters. The question that you ask yourself is where to biopsy this. Now, the simple answer to this, if you're not using any of those aids, if you use toluidine blue, then that can give you a marker. But generally, you biopsy, a simple answer to this is you biopsy the most abnormal appearing site. So when you have a large lesion like this, you have some site which is either speckled or site which is not uniform and nodular, a little bit indurated to your field, you biopsy that site. Yes, there is always a chance that you will biopsy the wrong area and get a wrong diagnosis, but the best you can do is biopsy the site which appears to be the most bad looking, or the most or the site which is most likely to harbor malignancy. So let us quickly go through the chart of management of these leukoplakias. So if you have a leukoplakia, first you need to eliminate all the habits. If you have a good response, then you manage accordingly. You don't need to do anything. If you have no response, then you go and biopsy these lesions. Or if there is no possible cause, as I said, if a patient is a non-smoker, the chances of malignancy are higher, so you must biopsy the lesions. Where to biopsy, I told you, either you can use a tool, or majority of the times, biopsy the area which is clinically most suspicious. Depending on what you get in the biopsy, mild dysplasia can be observed, moderate, severe dysplasia must be excised, and mild to moderate dysplasia, again, you can make a decision, but depending on your clinical parameter that I told you, size of the lesion, location of the lesion, appearance of the lesion, whether it's homogeneous, non-homogeneous, whether the patient takes habits, whether you stop habits, he was never a smoker. So put all your clinical criteria, put all your histological criteria available with you, and then make a decision whether you're going to operate these lesions or observe these lesions. A quick talk on, or a couple of slides on the most common lesion, or a very common lesion that we see, which is called as the submucous fibrosis. It is because of chewing the areca nut. The prevalence is about 5%. And as I said, the transformation rate is about 1% with the overall transformation rate of 5.2%. Now, as I said earlier, there is a classification, clinical and histopathological classification of submucous fibrosis. So early is only a burning sensation with no trismus, and you have fine fibrocollagen network and blood vessels dilated in the on histopathology. You have early where the buccal mucosa becomes mottled, becomes advanced where you have vertical fibrous glands, and you have progressive trismus, and in the most advanced you have severe trismus with extensive fibrosis and obliteration of the. Now what do you do? Again, biopsy. If you need to, now this is a condition. This involves the entire mucosa. So generally you do not biopsy the lesions. But if you find a suspicious area within the area of submucous fibrosis, please biopsy that lesions. The treatment is you must remove the predisposing factor. You have to stop the habit, and you have to give good nutrition. We'll talk about chemo prevention a little later. There are medical and surgical treatments for submucous fibrosis, and maxillofacials would know more about this than me, but there is, you can inject hyaluronidase, steroids, lycopene, pentoxifylline, everything has been described. Or you can excise these bands in stage 3 and 4 with scalpel or laser and reconstruct these bands with local flaps. So many a time, the most commonly performed surgery for submucous fibrosis is excision of the bands, doing a coronarectomy or a masticatory muscle myotomy, and then putting in a nasolabial flap, which is the most commonly used so that you do not get fibrosis of this area. And I've read that some of these are, earlier when I started out my practice, we were told that submucous fibrosis has no hope, and we just can't treat submucous fibrosis. It's the lesion which is not treatable. But nowadays there are many reports coming in that with surgery and stopping habits, you can achieve a good mouth opening with good physiotherapy and dietary control. So again, in a nutshell, if you have to look at these oral management of these oral pre-malignant lesions, you have to know which ones are bad. So the erythroplakias, erythroleukoplakias, the proliferative varicose leukoplakias. If you have a severe dysplasia in your leukoplakia or a leukoplakia which is non-homogeneous, these are the leukoplakia. The red boxes are the ones that
Dr. Devendra?
I think Dr. Chokar sir has, he has a weak internet. I'll just message him.
Yeah.
We'll wait for. I think he's joined us again.
I don't know what's happening.
Yeah, sir, we lost you for a bit. I think you can continue again. So you'll have to share your screen again.
Right. So I was talking about a question which is frequently asked in most of the panels is, if you have to excise these lesions, what is the margins that you take the lesions? Now again, as I said, the margins that you take is decided by the potential of these lesions to transform into malignancy. If you have one of the red boxes, then you must treat these as cancer. Treat it, because majority of the times, more than 50% of the times, there will be a cancer lurking around somewhere in these lesions. So treat it exactly like you will treat a well-differentiated squamous carcinoma. Otherwise, you will land up with a 1 or 2 millimeter margin. For other lesions which are homogeneous, which are not, which you don't want to observe because they are a bit large, you can do a little bit of concern, or especially if they are on the tongue where you think a large excision land up with significant morbidity, you can do a conservative excision of say 2 to 3 millimeter with a 3 millimeter margin or 4 millimeter margin. And if God forbid, if some malignancy develops or is found, because in biopsy, 35% of the time you will miss a malignancy. But put your clinical criteria and your histological criteria in between. You can decide which ones to excise widely and which ones to excise conservatively. If you have a large homogeneous lesion which is not going away, then you can excise this conservatively, and most of the times you'll be fine. Coming to the last topic is chemo prevention. Chemo prevention is the use of drugs or natural agents which hinder or delay cancer development. Okay, as I said, you have prevention is 3 types. I've alluded to this earlier, and most of the chemo prevention we do is usually a secondary or tertiary. I'll quickly run through these slides. This is the last part of my talk. As you all know, cancer is, we all say and we all show this slide that cancer is multi-step progression, but only 20 or to 30% of the cancers that we see in our outpatient department will actually develop from a pre-malignant lesion. Most of them will develop de novo. So yes, there is a stepwise progression of cancer from normal to dysplasia to this, but most of the times you will directly see a cancer developing and not see these stages in your clinical practice. So there are various chemopreventive agents that you look at. The most commonly studied is the retinoids, which are a group of chemical compounds comprising of vitamin A, its natural analogs and synthetic derivatives. And Hong was the earlier one to look at 13-cis-retinoic acid. He got a good reduction in size of these leukoplakias, and some of the dysplasias, or many of the dysplasias, reversed. But the problem was that the dose that we needed to give this was toxic. To do this was toxic. And after stopping the treatment with the agent, some of the leukoplakias reversed back. So they came back. So again, this was not used in clinical practice. Shankar Narayan used it, vitamin A, 3 lakh international units per week, 52% of the lesions subsided. When you use beta carotene, 33% subsided against a placebo, but only 10% subsided. And this prompted people not to use it in secondary setting, but in the tertiary setting. We were getting exciting results. So why not use it in patients who have already had cancer? And some people have used it. 103 patients post-treatment with radiation therapy were given 13,6 retinoic acid versus placebo. There was no difference in the recurrence rates, but the appearance of second primary was much lesser in patients who got 13,6 retinoic acid versus placebo. But there are other results in literature which tell us that giving these chemopreventive agents, especially vitamin A, has no difference in second primary rates, as Khoury et al. Reported. So generally, there is no consensus yet whether to use them as a primary, secondary, or tertiary prevention. Couple of other commonly investigated and used chemopreventive agents, the COX-2 inhibitor, which is blocks the production of prostaglandins. Prostaglandins, as you know, is involved in cell proliferation and promotes angiogenesis. So selective COX-2, because COX-1 can cause gastritis. COX-2, celecoxib, used in some phase 2 studies, found to show significant reduction, but again in clinical trials only. EGFR inhibitors, we all know that it is used in routine treatment nowadays, combined with radiation therapy. The Bonner's trial told us that. Whether it can be used as chemoprevention, yes, there is a study looking at TKIs, erlotinib. They gave erlotinib to high-risk individuals, that is individuals who had confirmed LOH, that is loss of heterozygosity. They had 150 patients, gave erlotinib 150 milligram per day for 12 months. They did not find any difference in disease-free survival. The problem was half of the patients required dose reduction. So there are two problems with chemopreventive agents. One is once you stop them, most of the lesions will come back. And two is that the dose that is required sometimes to do this or achieve good results is quite toxic. Again, vitamin E has been used. Vitamin E with, it has been used for SPTs, second primary tumors in patients with stage 1, 2 treated with RT. They used a combination of alpha tocopherol and beta carotene. Now, there were subsequently, after this trial started, there were results that beta carotene caused increase in incidence of lung cancer, and alpha tocopherol actually caused increase in mortality. So it was a negative trial, or actually caused harm. There are a host of other agents that are being used. The PARPs, the mTOR inhibitors, folic acid, curcumins, green tea extracts, the Bowman brick inhibitors, which is available in soybean, resveratrol, which is now being studied for COVID, I'm told. These are available in raspberries, strawberries, and various berries. So a host of them that have been studied, and you will find them various publications on these. But the bottom line is none of them currently are to be used in your clinical practice. If you have to tell your patient you want to prevent malignancy, stop your habit and eat good nutrition. That is the only thing. Please do not prescribe vitamin A, vitamin E to your patients to prevent either malignancy or prevent second malignancy. Currently, it has no role. We do not know the exact dosage. Some of them can cause harm. And usually when you stop these, the lesions come back. So other agents, biochemoprevention has been used. You have these adenoviruses, which have modified viruses which replicate in p53 mutant cells and destroy them. So various agents have been used to try chemoprevention. This just completes the list. So what has happened? Despite 40 years of research, we have very little success. That is mainly because these chemopreventive agents have been used in various subsites of the head neck, like larynx and oropharynx, oral cavity, and because the pre-malignant lesions at various sites have different response and different behaviors. As I said, the scheduling we yet don't know. We don't know how much dose to give. There are different schedules which are used for different time points. Some use it for 1 year, some for 2 years, some for 6 months. So we exactly don't know how much to use it for. This age variance is there. If you use it in the elderly, the transformation rates are different as compared to young, as I told you. There are issues with bioavailability and issues with toxicity. So chemoprevention, if I have to tell you in one line, do not use it currently in routine clinical practice. I see a lot of practitioners prescribing vitamin A, vitamin E. Yes, you can do it because sometimes the patients, also tell us that give me something for this. But the only advice that you give them is to stop habit and to have good nutrition. So to conclude my presentation, currently for oral pre-malignant disorders, as the WHO calls it now, there are lack of uniform guidelines. You must base your decision depending on your history, your clinical examination. I told you the clinical factors, which site to biopsy, depending on the histology that you get from your biopsy results. And then you make a decision whether you're going to observe these lesions, because 35% will regress on their own. If you remember the rule of 30% will stay as they are, 30% will regress on their own, and 30% will progress. So only 30 to 35% are going to progress. And I've told you which ones are more likely to progress and which ones you must biopsy and treat. And in future, maybe better understanding of molecular mechanism of carcinogenesis will allow us to identify newer targets. Thank you very much, and I'm open for questions if you have any.
Yeah. So can we, yeah, thank you. So shall we take a few questions? There's some.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so initially, so it's about the pathogens. Like Dr. Pawan and Dr. Vinay, they have asked about what is the cause and reason basically for the malignant transformation of patients with no habits. Like, what do we per se think about? Like, why do these non-habit users get lesions, and why is there a malignant transformation in them?
Right. Great question. The very basis of that, what is described in literature, is that it's besides etiology, besides tobacco and other factors, there is a genetic predisposition to malignant transformation. And that is why in patients who don't have habits, or even in patients who have habits, some of them will transform earlier than others. So there is some underlying genetic mechanism that is taking part. We have not understood it completely as of now. And that is why you get lesions in patients who have never chewed tobacco or never had alcohol in their life. You will still get, and these lesions are more likely to transform into malignancy because of the underlying genetic mechanism.
So is this the same explanation also for, like, some of these sites are more predisposed? We just saw that the tongue and floor of the mouth and all that. But like buccal mucosa, we generally say, is it that because of the same thing, or there is something to do with the mucosal lining or anything, sir?
It is generally to do with the mucosal lining. The non-keratinized ones are higher transformation than the gingiva. So it is, one is to do with the mucosal lining, and two, it is also to do with where your the liquid or the whatever you say, the juice of the habits that you take is there. So in smokers, you have higher risk of transformation, and in Indian subcontinent, now these are global figures that I told you. In Indian subcontinent, you have a little higher rate of transformation in the buccal mucosa because of the tobacco quid that you keep there.
So a lot of questions on basically primarily the management. So though you have discussed quite extensively, you've got a good idea of it. Like suppose these lesions are, a lot of these lesions we keep on a watch. Like we just saw that homogeneous ones are good ones, and we try to see them and keep a watch. What do you think should be our schedule of recalling these patients every 3 months, 6 months? And when do you think we should again think of a biopsy for these patients if we are following them for a year or two with similar findings? Or what guideline will you tell us?
Yeah. So Shubhra, as I said, there are no guidelines. There's really very little literature available, and we go by our clinical judgment. So when you see a lesion like this and you think it's homogeneous and you think you can observe it, we follow the principle of squamous carcinoma. We call them every 3 or 4 months initially for the first 2 years, and then increase the period of increase the interval to 6 months to a year. Having said that, the second question, which is a good question, is when do you then intervene? If you have change in size of the lesion, or if you have change in color of the lesion. So anything that prompts you that tells you that this lesion has changed in character, you will go and biopsy the lesion, or at that time decide to intervene. The second thing is if the patient continues habits and you have a slight change in the lesion. If the patient does not stop habits, the transformation is going to be higher, then you would want to intervene earlier than later. Having said that, Shubhra, in literature, if you read, even if you excise or don't excise, the malignant transformation rate has exactly shown to be the same. So just by excising the lesion, it's not a guarantee, and this is an important point. By just excising the lesion, you don't tell the patient you're cured. You must tell the patient that yes, you had a high-risk lesion, test come negative, but I must keep you on follow-up because the chance of you developing a malignancy is exactly the same if I had not excised your lesion at all. So just because you've excised it, the chances of malignancy do not decrease.
It's also the case, right? We do get the lesions back many times, especially the pre-malignant, even if we do excision. So
yes, exactly. That's the point. Right?
There was actually a question for that. So, like, do we go for in toto excision of the lesion if we have planned so? And
Right.
or you will think, or what is the role of a laser? Like we excise the part of the lesion as a suspicious area as a biopsy and then do laser. So what is the role of laser in these lesions? Because
Right.
a lot of
So-
people do want to use lasers.
Correct, correct. So Shubhra, see, the laser is just a tool. You excise with knife, you excise with cautery, you excise with laser. The laser, there is a theoretical advantage that the wound healing following laser is better. And because the depth of penetration of laser and the thermal damage with laser is lesser than using electrocautery in the coagulation mode, that's why you can excise these lesions superficially. Now, if you decide to excise a lesion which you think is not very malignant, but it is large, and that's why you want to excise it, you can use a laser and excise it very superficially. It is just a tool that helps you excise the lesion with less thermal damage. The wound healing is supposed to be better, and you can get a nice, good slice of the tongue or the buccal mucosa that decreases the morbidity. Most of the time, the lesion will be negative. But suppose the lesion comes positive, then you can go in again and excise the scar tissue with a wide margin. Now, this is debatable what I'm saying, but that is what is generally done in clinical practice.
There was a question by Jyotsna about contact scopes, sir. You did discuss about narrowband imaging, but what about contact scope?
Yeah, so all these contact scopes and narrowband imaging are the tools which tell us, especially these are used for margins more than detecting. Yeah, they are used for telling you where to biopsy the lesion also, but also they are used for margins. The contact scope also tell you about a little bit of the histology, and they have been still being investigated. They're not routinely used in clinical practice.
There was another question about this steroid use you told about in OSMF and hyaluronidase. Is there any protocol which you follow, sir, over there or anything?
No protocol as such, and I treat very little submucous fibrosis. Usually, I get patients with the cancer in submucous fibrosis. So what we do is, if the cancer is on the right side, we excise the lesion, and sometimes we carry out the choroidectomy on the opposite side, the same sitting, and put in a nasolabial flap to increase the mouth opening. But it's a very difficult lesion to treat. No, I'm not aware of a protocol of steroids.
And also, sir, because you did mention OSMF now, the primary question many times arises in OSMF as a pre-malignant lesion. When do we biopsy in OSMF? Like leukoplegia, we have this criteria, like we have homogeneous and and we know erythroleukoplegia is more. But in OSMF, what happens is patient's mouth opening is less, and then you land up with a small ulcer sometimes, and which may heal, may not heal. That generally the ulcer is because of a traumatic tooth infiltrating. So when do we jump to a biopsy, or because these are difficult biopsies also to be very, sometimes you have to take the patient to the OT for a biopsy or examination also. So what do you think we should go in, and when should we go in?
So exactly what I told you earlier, if you have submucous fibrosis, which is just like a band of thickening all around, somebody asked about field cancerization. This is something like field cancerization. But then you do not biopsy. Do not go and try punching areas at different, because that will worsen the situation. It will worsen the fibrosis. If there is a change in one of the areas, or there is a lesion, as you said, ulcer which you can pinpoint an etiology, take care of the etiology and wait for a week to 10 days for the ulcer to disappear. If that happens, you're fine. If it doesn't happen, go in and biopsy that ulcer. So any change that is happening on the submucous fibrosis, any lesion that appears, any change in the color, biopsy that lesion. Do not go and indiscriminately biopsy submucous fibrosis. Somebody asked in the chat about field cancerization, a very difficult problem to treat. You cannot treat field cancerization at all. You treat the cancers that develop and keep other areas under follow-up.
And so will there be a different protocol for these same pre-malignant lesions for a post-treated cancer patient? Shall we be more suspicious to those patients? Like, shall we be more aggressive in them, or shall we just follow the same protocol?
Yeah, good point. I think I missed that in my talk. If you have one of the clinical factors is a presence of a pre-malignant lesion of previously operated area. That is one of the high risk factors. So thanks for bringing that up. So that is one point that I missed.
In the chat, sir, actually.
Yeah, that's one point I missed. Whoever brought it, thank you, because that is a point that you must add to clinical factors that you keep in mind.
Yeah, because there was a very similar line. There was a question that they had a proliferative varicose lesion for a post 5 years, actually, in a marginal mandible treated patient. So shall we go ahead? And so the answer is, of course, you should go ahead.
Yes, you should.
And sir, of course, you did tell about this chemo prevention, lot of methods, but we also know that there is high chance of even recurrence of these lesions the moment chemo prevention started. Though chemo prevention did show its benefit, there are a lot of people saying that there was again the recurrence, so it's not this thing. I think we're quite through, sir. Do you?
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anything else? There was another question for AFTIS also. I don't think there is in AFTE there is anything to do with pre-line. Anything you
No,
want to
there's nothing to do
contribute
with it.
because
No,
it's
this is
nothing to
vitamin
be worried
deficiency.
about actually in AFTE. So you
Yeah,
have to treat
the
AFTE like an
nutritional and
AFTE
vitamin
also.
deficiency. That's why you get asked.
So you don't have to worry. There was another question by Josna about melanoma, sir. You want to talk about pre-malignant lesion in that and the management. It's little out of the oral cavity.
Yeah, that is one thing that I did put up. Melanoplakias are, these kind of a black lesions that you get on the oral cavity. Transformation rate is extremely low. They're not readily. You can put them as transformation rate somewhere akin to lichen planus or homogeneous leukoplakias. So you keep them under observation, and if you have any change, you biopsy them.
Done. Any other further questions? Otherwise, I think we are. So thank you so much. It was an exhaustive lecture actually. Though we got pre-malignant, but then the pre-malignant is almost like long read
It's
for everybody.
big. And there's a lot of confusion there regarding biopsy and margins and things like that. So
it is clinical. To be very true, more because cancer, everybody knows it's a basic line in treatment, and cancer, frank cancer is never a problem. The problem is
Shubhra, as I always tell my residents that to diagnose anything is very difficult. I'm working in a tertiary cancer institute. I think for the last 15 years, I've not diagnosed anything. All patients come to me with a diagnosis of cancer. So it is very easy for me, But out there in practice, if you get a lesion, diagnosing a lesion is extremely, extremely difficult.
So true, so true.
Keep all these clinical parameters in mind when you see a lesion.
Thank you so much, sir, for this exhaustive lecture. Actually, it was
Thanks, Shubhra. Thanks, Akshay.
Shalini, you can take over. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Shubhra. Thank you, Chokar sir. That was indeed a very exhaustive lecture, and I'm sure the postgraduates benefited by it immensely. Thank you so much for joining us today. I must thank Dr. Anand and Dr. Bhargav, who've been helping us in the background with our social media platforms and this hosting this session as well. Thank you, sir. I think this is also going to be this was viewed live on Facebook as well, and this will also be shared on our YouTube channel as well.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, Dr. Shubhra. Thank you, Dr.